How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you all. Today, I'm joined by a strength and conditioning coach with over 20 years' experience. He spent the last 10 years as the lead strength and conditioning coach for England Rugby. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Tom Tombleson. How are you doing?
Evening, mate. How are you? I'm pretty good. Pretty good, thanks.
Good. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. But I suppose the first question, how are you getting on? What's been happening in your world recently?
I'm um I'm the lead SSC with GB Rugby Sevens at the moment, and we're in the middle of our season, so we're prepping for our Vancouver leg of the World Sevens series. We'll be going at the end of the week, so just finishing up a week in camp in Sunbury, and we'll be flying at the weekend for the Vancouver comp. So we had Perth a couple of weeks ago, 42-degree heat, and we're going to Vancouver and it's -4. So yeah,
Oh, no.
we're getting the mittens out.
Yeah, yeah. It's much better than the weather. So I'm just based just on the outskirts of Leeds. So much better weather where you've been compared to up north. And how have you found working with the sevens and going on the circuit? I know obviously you've got a massive amount of experience, but how are you finding it at the minute and balancing everything with travel and being in camp and balancing your own life as well.
Well, I'm quite used to the sort of the camp-based model of being at home and then periods of camp, and I'm used to the travel, so that's been fairly seamless.
Yeah.
It's a great vocation, this role, because it's such a physical sport, it's a fitness sport, and you're dealing with an extreme version of rugby where everyone's just got to be generally just a little bit fitter and faster than what you're used to. So it's for an SSC, it's a great thing because you really it's a great way to cut your teeth.
Yeah. And do you enjoy kind of like the travel side of it, because obviously changing location, there's other factors that you got to take. And this might be a little bit of a tangent, but you said there about the heat in Perth, is that kind of like challenges that you enjoy kind of taking on board with the athletes that you're working with?
Yeah, it's just another physical performance challenge, and if you get it right, it's a way you can get an edge. So, in all the things that you do in such an extreme physical sport, there's edges to be taken in many different ways, whether it be acclimating to the conditions, alleviating the stresses of travel, nutrition, physical training, the stuff on the field with the ball. There's ways you can gain an edge, and that's just for me, that's another way to gain an edge. Some teams will get leveled up with it, some teams will suffer. And I personally love that challenge because there's ways to do it really well, and they're there to be uncovered. So we look a lot at other worlds, see how they do it. So looking at the Institute of Sports and what I've done in my previous role with England Rugby. So I love the challenge personally. I like the sort of the holistic approach to getting a body right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose with that as well, when you like what you said there, when you do get it right, it's going to have a big impact on the pitch, which is obviously what you want. Um, I know I did quite a brief introduction there and spoke about obviously your travel, but for everyone listening who might not know your background, experience, basically how you got involved in coaching, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I started with the GB Sevens, and I was doing some contract work with the Premier League football team back in July when I left England Rugby, and I've been with England Rugby for 10 years in different roles, coordinator roles, supporting roles, sports science role even. And that was for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I did 6 years in Super Rugby with the New South Wales Waratahs. And then prior to that, I was a rugby player myself. I was an athlete. I was played a bit in sevens and mostly sort of second tier English semi-professional rugby and in Australia and in England. So I was a wannabe player, but wasn't quite good enough. I was probably a bit too focused on the physical stuff as opposed to the technical side of the game, which is my failing, which you know made sense why I ended up going into this role. But all the while, though, I was sort of earning my coaching badges metaphorically and trying to gain experience with coaching from maybe from my undergraduate time at university. I've been coaching. I actually started probably fitness coaching at school when we didn't have an S&C coach at school in our rugby team, so I kind of took the mantle up. I even trained some of the teachers when I was 18. So it was just something that it just seemed to be a bit of a natural thing for me because I was always obsessed with the physical side of things, probably ever since I saw my first Schwarzenegger film. And you know, when I was growing up, that sort of those 1990s muscle films were a big influence. And um, in the sort of that period of time, the sports stars, whether that be the American ones or even gladiators on TV,
Yeah.
like physical conditioning took a big up leap, and that had a big effect on me. So that was always my bias.
Yeah, yeah. It's like there was a you made me smile then because there's that meme, isn't there, of like what was training like when you were growing up, and it's the Rocky films, and
Yeah.
is it Commando where he's got the log on his shoulder.
I'll tell you how many times I've paused that shot. The same with Rocky Four. There's a scene in Red Heat when Schwarzenegger walks into a Russian onsen, and like me and my mates just used to pause that, like check out how do we get this muscle like this? Like, well, you need a lot of drugs, but apart from that, he trained really hard. So you know, yeah, they were big influences to me. They were just videos you put on and just watch a lot.
Yeah. Well, one on that in terms of influence, because I know obviously, from your experience there, that the teams that you've worked with, and the level of coaching that you've done. One question I like to ask is who kind of in terms of coaches or mentors, who kind of influenced your approach to training? Because you mentioned earlier about that whole picture in terms of physical performance. Who's influenced your coaching, or has that changed in terms of how you work with athletes, or how you deliver coaching?
Well, I think initially there were negative influences that had a rebound effect. So when I was in the academy at Northampton Saints, and then I was at Loughborough University, and I was surrounded by a lot of good athletes, and I was surrounded by a lot of good players that weren't good athletes, and vice versa. So I knew that it was a way to sort of gain an edge in performance, and I knew I was back then I was a bit bigger and stronger than my contemporaries. So I thought if I just got a bit more bigger and stronger, then I would be a better player. But obviously it doesn't work out like that, because when you climb the ladder, you're competing with people that are good athletes and also good players. So the influences were probably the people I was playing against as a player. In terms of coaching, um, I was at the I was working in Power Base, and I was an undergraduate at Loughborough University, and there's institute coaches, so English Institute of Sport coaches. There's GB athletes walking the halls of Power Base, and that influences you because they're doing stuff at the time that you're looking at going, I don't know what the hell that is, but it looks cutting edge to me. And they're very methodical, and they're quite academic with their work. And there weren't many people that I thought were really academic and applied, but good coaches. And they're quite conversely, some of the good coaches didn't seem to have that really good applied basis to their work. So I remember thinking at the time, there's no one here who's like an all-rounder. There's no one here that's really quite good at everything. So that for me was an influence in that it made me actually think, oh, like if I was being coached by one of them, I'd want to, someone that had had a bit of everything. They could talk me through the theory. You could have a laugh with them. You knew they cared. They weren't a bookworm. They weren't too studious in a way that they couldn't communicate it. So I would say that influences were people that weren't an influence. They just weren't they were everything what you didn't want them to be. And in an indirect way, it kind of created an idea in your head what you wanted.
Yeah, yeah,
And when you're in the academy as well, I remember thinking a few times, yeah, this is how I'd do it if I was younger, if I was a bit more experienced, even though I had no basis from which to form that opinion other than just what I thought would have made me feel a little bit better.
yeah,
And that wasn't a slight on anyone. I was just a bloody 20-year-old academy kid. I was not the priority at all. But on the back of it, if you've got a coaching hat on, and clearly I did at that age, you start to think what you could do in 10 years' time when maybe it's your turn to coach. So I would say those experiences as a player were probably the biggest influences. My major influence initially was which still is now, he's still a very good friend, was Dr. Phil Wagner, who took me on to some internships in America. at the Peak Performance Project and Sparta Performance Science in Santa Barbara and San Francisco. So I went for 4 summers there during my postgraduate studies in physiology, and I used to go there for the summers. I just paid to go over there and just watch the guy because he was a brilliant coach. He still is.
Yeah.
He's now someone as a friend, so he had a big influence on me. Going to America, they've got such a big focus on the technical side of coaching, because they have to be so good at things like, the 3-cone drill and the combine prep drills.
Yeah.
They're very, very good technical coaches, and that had a big influence on me because I think in England, certainly when I was growing up, I don't think the S&Cs were quite as technically orientated as we were. They had all the best practice, but when it came to cueing, coaching, language of coaching, the way you actually instruct someone to lift, jump, sprint a little bit better, I thought the Americans were good there. So that had a big impact initially, I'll say.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I like to ask that question because obviously, you look at where you're at now for younger coaches. It's kind of like, oh well, what you've learned. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Of thinking, seeing something and thinking about, well, actually, what I don't want to be. Whereas I think sometimes there's maybe a point of just trying to replicate what other coaches are doing rather than thinking about maybe not their own style, but that there are just approaches to it. Because I think from everything you can learn from different coaches, different techniques, like what you said there over in America, picking those things up and then bringing that back. I suppose that goes into my next question then of, when you're seeing coaches coming through and trying to apply that knowledge onto the gym floor, onto the track. Um, do you think sometimes where it breaks down is trying to get all that knowledge and being able to put that across to the athletes? Do you think that's kind of like a common fault that you see and is maybe often overlooked in terms of, the actual practical side of things, delivering it from that knowledge that a lot of coaches have?
Yeah, yeah. And I think certainly initially when you're younger, you want to apply the knowledge you've got, regardless of whether it's the right thing at the right time, because it's the only thing you've got in your head. There's not a load of options. Like when I first started coaching, I had a certain amount of options what to do in the gym, so everyone did that. Whereas as you get older, you have more tools and you've got more options. So you pick the ones that are better, good for the athletes, the context and the environment. Whereas when you're younger, you just want to do what's in your head.
Yeah.
So you try and fit people to the method as opposed to fitting the method to the people. So that's what I would have been guilty of initially. And I look back at it thinking, oh God, that was not good for that group or that guy back then. But it was the only gun I had.
Yeah.
So, it was going to try and hit any target.
Yeah. 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 Because I think that comes from. Do you think that's like a natural cycle that coaches have to take? Because it's kind
Yeah,
of that thing of everyone's going to say, well, you need more experience, but actually you need to kind of maybe make those mistakes, gain
yeah,
that experience. Do you think that's kind of like a natural cycle?
yeah. I think so. Like if you say if you're learning a new language, no matter what the conversation is, you're going to use the same limited amount of words, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because your vocabulary is limited. So I think it's the same with your coaching toolbox, whether that be your cues or your periodization schemes or your exercise selections. They're going to have to be fit anything you're coaching, and you need to make those mistakes. But you just got to coach, and you've got to watch people coach a lot, and you've got to go to different worlds. My biggest environmental influences were my time in Australia and America. They weren't in England, and I think that made me a much more rounded coach. I think when I came back to work in England in 2014, because I saw things from a couple of different worlds, from different sports, and it just gave me more an option list, more of a menu list for all the things that I could do. So I'm not sold on one method. I'm just sold on improving the outcome, and it doesn't really bother me as long as it's not harmful and it's not too laborious or what's the word, detrimental performance. The outcomes, I think that's the right thing. So I
Yeah.
used to be really dogmatic when I was younger. No, you don't do this you don't do machines, you don't do this exercise. You got to squat full depth. You should be clean and jerking. I'm like, oh, that's because that's what I was good at coaching.
Yeah. 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 Because with that as well, I think it's that thing of it's kind of getting out of that comfort zone, like what you said there, Australia, America, different styles of things. And I think sometimes with that, what you're good at, like what you mentioned with like the clean and jerk and those sorts of things, it's good to maybe just stay in that. Whereas actually that might not be right for that team, that
Yeah,
athlete, to have that outcome
yeah,
with that as well. So, and I'm quite glad you said there about like the toolbox because this is, what I say to other coaches as well. It's that thing of your toolbox gets bigger, but actually when you're coaching, sometimes either programming gets a little bit more efficient, your cues get a little bit more efficient. Do you think sometimes where that breakdown is, or where people or where coaches sometimes forget about the outcome, is that they're trying to be too complicated, overcomplicate the program rather than thinking about right, what is actually needed for this performance, for this team, for this athlete?
yeah. I think so. I mean, and I've definitely been guilty of that. Whether that be trying to shoehorn too much stuff in, so you get a lot of interference, whether it be trying to fit things in and swapping them too frequently, so you never find it a yield or a sort of a naturalization process to any of the exercises. Maybe a lack of appreciation of how long it takes for things to basically change someone's nervous system. I think we probably move on from exercises too early. And that's generally because of the coaches sort of want to change and need novelty. Rarely it's because the athletes are going, I'm really, really bored of this.
Yeah,
I remember I was coaching in Australia in my job at the Waratahs. Some, a couple of Wallabies I was coaching at the time. I tried to change their program. I'm like, mate, just stop changing it. Just change the reps, change the order. I don't want to move from this exercise. It's good for me. And I was like, oh shit, I just assumed you'd want to move on from it in 4 weeks. I just used to change the whole routine every 4 weeks.
yeah,
I'm like, no, like they don't care about that change as much as you do. They're more focused on the game. Where I was a young strength coach and my whole week was about programming those exercises. So they were like, hey, just leave it. It's fine. Just mix everything else up. And that had an impact on me. I was like, well, what am I changing it for? I'm changing it for me. And
yeah,
then start to realize when you leave things in, actually, sometimes people's, what's the word? Well, their adaptation rates are different. Some guys, it takes a while. You've got to stick on it and stick on it. And you have a delayed sort of an effect. Some people need to, but depending on the neurotype, need to change quite quickly.
yeah.
But it's rarely as much as you think, I reckon. And I definitely use less exercise than I used to. I just let the exercise I have a bigger impact.
Yeah. And with that, because, and this might be a little bit of a tangent, but sometimes it is a case, you look at, you read about programming, it's like, cycles of training and changing exercises and those sorts of things. Why did you feel the need to, change the exercises when you maybe first started? Was it because, like what you mentioned, it was just because you felt you had a feeling from the players that they just wanted a change? You mentioned there obviously about the coaches maybe wanting to change it up, or was it maybe that, like what we touched on earlier, maybe the maybe softer skills of coaching of understanding where the players were and thinking, well, actually, they're all still doing well. We just need to change the other things. What do you think the reason was behind that?
I think there'll be a few, mate. I reckon there was sort of being seduced into the bright lights of a new exercise, thinking it was going to do more than it was. It was boredom and a lack of patience on maybe the results that the current stuff was giving you and not appreciating, like I said, training curves. It was probably as a young coach wanting to show your knowledge and that you've got more exercise up your sleeve, a bit of showmanship and trying to flex your academic muscles and
Yeah,
look at this, I've got this. Not understanding where the players are and just changing it because you had a plan in place that you'd periodized months before and not appreciating, you know, progressing your program on merit versus pre-planned structure. Um, Fear of a player being bored of it, and so changing it early. I mean, there's quite a few reasons.
yeah,
But think about what I would have been like maybe 15 years ago as a coach. I probably thought all of those things.
yeah. And with that, when we're talking about the elite level of sport, how do you kind of manage that now then? Because especially at the very very top level, there's pressure to perform to make sure that the athletes are performing. How, looking back and compared to where you are now, how do you kind of manage that? Like, is the pressure from there? How do you, communicate with the other coaches of actually, this is trying to steer the course and, striking that balance between actually, we maybe need to change it.
Um, Using a monitoring process, so you're tracking things that are KPIs for the training you're doing, whether that be speeds on the field or sort of force plate metrics, or whether that be even wellness markers and athlete perceptions of, sharpness scales. They're the things that tell you if your training is working. It won't so much be training performance, because training performance is an end to itself. You're doing the training to function better in the competition phase, aren't you? So I would look at sort of KPIs that bridge the gap between what you did in the gym and what you think is transferring to what you're doing on the field.
Yeah.
And there's objective markers for that that you can associate without being necessarily predictive.
And with that, because when you're having those markers, a little bit you mentioned earlier about if you're doing too many things, you don't know what's working. Do you
Yeah.
have like a bank of markers that you've used consistently? Because sometimes you can get lost in numbers. Do you
Yeah.
try to keep it relatively compact so it's just always useful? Because everything is information, everything's data, but it's what's going to actually be useful.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And you know what, mate? One of the biggest ones is just athlete perception of how they're feeling. It really is. And intuitive ones that know their bodies quite well. And if you've been with them long enough, you can use that as a good marker. So when I was, being with England for 10 years, there were some players that you'd been with for the whole 10 years. And you could talk to them about how their bodies were feeling. Oh, this, my back's a bit jacked up at the moment. My tendons are getting sore. You knew what things made them feel good, because for me, the first port of call is do no harm.
Yeah,
And then the second one is make them feel good and sharp. Their perception is that they feel confident they are. That's regardless of any other things that are having a direct transfer in the field, whether that be speed or, power or whatnot. Those kind of things that I think are real premium, not doing any harm, and the athlete feeling healthy and sharp. Because if you feel superhuman, you'll kind of raise up to it a little bit.
yeah,
If you feel like crap, then there's that devil on the shoulder tapping you, going, you feel like crap, you feel like crap, you're not at your best. And even if your, kinetic assessments are exactly the same, you'll play a bit more like Tarzan and a little bit less like Jane. That's the way I see it. And then, so that's the biggest one, the athlete reports. That's something I've got a lot of association in, on athletes that know their bodies well, and on athletes that know their bodies well on. It's hard to do that with new ones that you don't know well, because you're not sure what's the truth and what's not.
yeah,
But I'd do that. But then just some basic stuff like speeds on the field, whether, that might be the reliable GPS metrics you can hang your hat on, if you've got that type of, technology. And then some basic force plate stuff. And that might just be your power assessments whether that be, for me, it's the jump stuff, it's the jump metrics.
yeah,
That be your RSI or your counter movement things. And there's a kind of a list of things that I look at there at different times. They're the basics. Other people might use isometrics and stuff and other strength assessments. I used to look heavily at sort of, lower body strength scores and things like that, but there's too much skill involved in those movements. So I don't look at those in the same way that I used to.
yeah,
I say those buckets there, the sort of the stuff on the field, the kinetic assessments, and like I said, athlete reporting.
yeah. And because with that, it's interesting you mentioned there about, and you said that a couple of times, of athletes that understand their body, and obviously, at the elite level, you kind of assume that they'll have, and I can imagine they do have that awareness. Whereas there'll be some athletes that are a bit more into their training compared to maybe even now, even though strength and conditioning is the part and parcel of the majority of sports. But there's still some athletes that just want to focus on the game and the skill side of things. How if hopefully this makes sense, how do you try and get buy-in in terms of like the gym with them, with the other athletes, and try and say, look, we need to have a look at these markers because this is going to improve your performance. This is what's going to have that extra edge, like what we mentioned at the start, because there's some athletes that are kind of naturally gifted. I would say, how does that kind of fit within that system, if you like, if that makes sense?
I found that being heavy-handed with these types is utterly pointless.
Yeah,
Because I just push back. It's no point at all. So if you genuinely believe that there's something in the weight room that's going to affect their performance, that they're undercooking, you sit them down and you bring hard evidence that what you're saying is true. You can't come with any fluff because they just think you're a strength guy trying to get strength numbers up.
yeah,
Those types of athletes are ballers. They just want to play the game and they want to be a good player. So you have to come to them with some hard facts that are very, very waterproof that tell you that if you do this, you can get this, as opposed to you will do this. It's more of a potential to their performance. Look, if we do this amount of work on you on there, with regard in some of your sort of, say your power training, you might better get this edge in your initial acceleration. And the reasons are for this. And we've seen that this works with this. Look what happened when we did this with you before. So you just got to come with a portfolio where you're not attacking them, telling them they're lazy or anything like that. You're allowing them to look at the facts and go, okay, so when I did this block of plyometrics and this sort of these special exercises, I was running my best 10-meter time. And then when I stopped doing it, it tailed off. Okay. So it's a collaborative process. And you ask them, what are the things in the gym you like doing? And what are the things you don't? And there is rarely will an athlete tell you I don't like anything at all.
yeah,
I'd say to you something like, I hate the heavy grind stuff. And they might be that type that the heavy stuff really crushes them, but they really are doing power stuff like jumps and throws and Olympic lifts. But you never knew that. You just thought that when they weren't doing the heavy squats, they were being fucking lazy. So you ask them what they want, you ask them what you think works for them, and they might surprise you. They might tell you some things that, I thought you weren't into that. Well, maybe he wasn't into that when you did that, and that before and after it. But if you did that in its whole, then he might really attack it. So I think it's got to be a collaborative process. You find out what they think works for them, and then you look at your common ground, and then you double down on that.
yeah. And with in terms of having that in a team sport, because like what you mentioned, about changing the exercises every 4 weeks, does that come from in terms of managing the team for their sessions? Is it kind of having that overriding system and then just adjusting smaller things to get the best out of each athlete?
Yeah, I think if you've got a philosophy in a training philosophy, so you might have a coaching philosophy, a personal philosophy, a training philosophy, whereby you say this is how my program fits in any one type of arm. Or maybe I want a bilateral lift and a single leg lift. I want something for the hamstrings. I want a power exercise. I want an exercise that preaches range of motion in X Y Z. How you do those things doesn't really matter as long as you're trying to achieve the same thing and you've got a clear structure by which you're trying to approach each block of training. And then you might come to them with options saying, look, we want to do this. We want to work on some power. I know you don't like Olympic lifting because you can't catch because your wrist, but I've got X, Y, Z. What do you want to try? Do you want to try all of them and just pick the best one? And then we can go hard on that. It might be that none of them work. Then you've got to come to the table with a couple of other options. There's loads of ways to increase rate of force development. It doesn't have to be a hang power clean.
Yeah,
And quite often, there will be something out there that a player really likes that you just haven't found yet, that doesn't suit him, that hasn't suited him yet. But then you find it and they go, oh, I love that. I love that. Let's do a bit more of that.
yeah.
I haven't found an athlete that generally hates everything in the gym. You just got to find something that suits you both.
Yeah. I suppose that goes back to, what we were chatting about at the start where right, we're just going to do clean and jerk or these exercises because whereas you mentioned a couple of times there, just give options. We're going to do something for this.
Yeah.
These are the options that you've got, whereas sometimes making it too rigid because I think to a certain extent, a lot of people or the majority of people don't like being told you're just doing this one thing because
No
then
one likes
that's where you're going to get that
it's like I've got kids. You tell a kid that they can, you give them a meal. Like we're adults, right? We pick what we eat, don't we?
Yeah.
If you give a kid a meal that they haven't picked, and I said to you every day, Stephen, you're going to eat this, you'd be like, I don't fancy that tonight. It's the same with the exercise selection. You're going to go this exercise and you can do this. They go, well, I don't want to do that today. I don't feel like it. Whereas if they were the master of their own destiny, they'd pick something else. Like I'm a big fan of exercise. We used to call it sort of exercise S&C freestyle. We used to do a lot of sessions under him, my previous coach with England Rugby, where we'd just have S&C sessions, and they would pick what they wanted to do in the S&C session. We'd have a sign-up board of mobility, power, strength, maybe some special exercises, some speed, some technical work, and they would pick what they wanted to do. All the non-negotiables would be, sorted out in the week, and they'd do that, and everyone had something they wanted to do when they had the choice, because we're born to choose, aren't we?
Yeah.
Whereas, like you said, if you tell everyone what they're doing, like who's really going to be accountable for something they never chose to do? No one.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to like what you said about the perception. If they've chosen it, they're probably going to feel that because either they
Yeah,
enjoy it or it makes them feel good, and then
yeah,
that's going to ultimately, again, like what you mentioned earlier, have that outcome on the on the pitch or on the performance.
yeah.
With that, because we've spoken a lot there about how best to approach that with athletes. When we're talking about for a national team and they're coming from clubs and maybe different S&C backgrounds, is there any challenges when it comes to, because at the national level, there's different and maybe different environments, it might be a different environment itself. How does that kind of does anything that you've mentioned there change in terms of your approach, or is it a case of those same systems apply? It's just trying to bring those different athletes together to get that buy-in.
Yeah, it's difficult because they're coming from different philosophies and training directions, aren't they? And they may well be doing things that maybe don't complement the way you're trying to play the game when you're a national team. We had under Eddie Jones, we had a distinct game model that wasn't the same as the model that was being used by some players at their clubs at the time. So we needed to physically prepare a little bit different. Now, if they're coming from a program they're not used to, and you ask them to play for their country in the most stressful games of their lives, they don't want to change their weights program because that's kind of their security in their emotional attachment, because that's what they thought helped get them there. So they don't want to change that because they don't want to stop doing what got them there, do they? And I completely understand that myself. So we used to sort of have a mix between some of those non-negotiable lifts that they wanted to do, that they were used to doing, and then a sprinkling, maybe 50-40% of the program would be a sprinkling on stuff that we thought we needed to give them that would equip them for the way we wanted to play, especially if the demands of the game are different.
Yeah.
So it's half and half.
Yeah. And with that, because one key thing I picked up there is some of the most stressful uh, games that they'll play, not just physically but mentally as well. And at the start, you said about that full picture approach, that holistic approach. And when we're talking, obviously the Six Nations is on now, World Cups, tours. How do you manage that stress on athletes when it comes from the training, whether it be like the load or even like the mental side of things? Because especially now, people are going from the season straight into quite in intense games. How or did your approach change over time in terms of managing that? Because obviously they're going from the clubs to then an intensive block and then going back to their clubs, or having a little bit of a breather. How do you manage that to make sure that the performance is optimal every time they step out onto the pitch?
Well,
I
there's
realize
always
that's quite a big question.
no, that's fine. There was a period with England where for a few years, we were pushing training development. We're trying to increase jump scores and rep maximums, and I'm not sure why we were doing it, because it wasn't for the athlete. Because if you're hitting a PB on Tuesday, you're not going to feel great on Saturday. Like, so I had a big shift a couple of years in where, for me, my focus was how I could support a player is by helping them feel great and helping them feel sharp and healthy. And that goes back to the other thing I mentioned, the other philosophy I mentioned, about doing no harm. So I wanted them to leave the gym feeling better than when they entered the gym. And that often meant not doing your heavy sets of lower body weights. It might be because some people just love doing it and they want to keep it in the program the whole time and it made them feel good. So it might be that. With other people, it was to take that away because they were doing it all the time with their clubs anyway. They just didn't need to do it. Like don't need to lift. You don't need to lift at 90%, 85% every week. You just don't. Especially the lads who've been, 10-year veterans. Like you could take that out for a couple of weeks and nothing would happen. It would be absolutely fine. If anything, it would make them sharper. So the philosophy was do no harm and feel great, feel healthy. So when I changed that focus, that immediately meant, well, what does that take for these people? So you start to individualize more straight away. And then secondly, you stopped worrying about scores and you just became more concerned about health markers for me, which meant that you start to look at other objective measures, like I said, reporting scores, sort of scores on the jump kinetics that meant that they were fresh versus developed. The symmetrics within the CMJ dashboards that I think are good markers for sort of physical rebounding versus actual, force potential. And that's a sort of a long dialogue for another time. But they were the things that I started to look at. Range of motion in the hips, like even that, how they're sleeping, any signs of sort of strength-induced stress. That I wanted to remove those, and make them feel great.
Yeah. And I think that's, from the from my point of view, what you've said there, rather than having it as like, they've come in and they're in a tournament or anything like that of working harder. Actually, it's a case of, we'll know that they're the top of the game. The international athletes. If they're feeling good, they've probably trained, they've done pre-season, they're doing a
Yeah,
season that they're
like
playing from there.
smarter, not harder. Like we'll get the lads 10 days before the first test match of the campaign. You're doing nothing other than fucking them up if you just drill
Yeah.
them in the gym. Like, and even if you've got 8 weeks of a Six Nations, 6 of those weeks is a test week.
Yeah.
So, forget it. But you can do some things that make them feel better. You can do some things that might get some performance increases that are a bit more indirect. Like, I don't know, it could be some joint scores that you're looking at. Like, it doesn't have to be the big meaty stuff. If it's a World Cup camp, that's different. You've got time there.
Yeah.
But just don't fuck them up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think there was quite a lot that we spoke about there. A couple of tangents thrown in, and I think some really great information there for coaches, Tom. My last question would be from everything that we've spoken about there, and for everyone listening, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom from what we've chatted about there?
The coaches,
Yeah,
um, meet your methods to the man. Don't try and meet the man to your methods. So you've got to see lots of worlds. You've got to see lots of different practices. You've got to have a really rich toolbox and of experiences, and then dial them down to sort of a battery of things that are really effective, that are malleable, and then you can fit them to different populations. Everyone's different. If you're a strength coach in rugby, you're going to work with Polynesians, you're going to work with Africans, you're going to work with Caucasians. You could be working with people with very different genetics, different neurotypes, different archetypes that will suit different things, and there will be things that work for them, and you've got to figure what they are out. And it won't just be by having a big encyclopedia of exercises. It will be talking with the player, collaborating with them, and getting to the bottom of what makes them feel and perform good. And if you do that, I don't think you can go too far wrong.
yeah,
Be curious and collaborate.
yeah. I think that first line that you did there, I'm a big fan of like quotes like that. I think that's just going to be the snippet of the podcast. I thought that was pretty cool. That some great take on points, some great tangents and topics covered there. Thanks a lot, Tom, for taking the time to jump on. If anyone has any questions about what we've chatted about today, or want to reach out to you, or see what you put out there, where can people find you, or reach out to you?
Well, there's not many names like mine in the world, so if you stick it in Instagram, my Instagram page comes up. I'm probably most active on that than any other platform. I read Twitter, but I'm not active on it so much.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm on TikTok, but Instagram is probably the place to visit. I've got a page, a personal page, and I've got a performance page, which is what I share with Ollie Richardson. And that's called TTOR Performance, Tour Performance. So you can look at either.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Tom, for taking the time to jump on. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.